So for some context, I'm a guy, and this happened when I was 18. I was planning on moving out of state for college, and I didn't want to pay the ridiculously high price for student housing. So me and my mom turned to Craigslist for better options. We found a lot of places near the school and for a reasonable price, but one we found would live in infamy for me. We found a place for $500 per month in an area near the school, so we instantly took it. On the day before my school's orientation, me and my parents drove down to the school and rented a hotel room for 2 nights. On the way down, I was texting the guy about the room, to which he gave a description as well as the address to where I would be going. I'd like to note that I was the one that was filtering through the options while my mom sent links for any new openings. After texting back and forth, he asked for me to send a pic of myself right after he sent a pic of himself. I sent him one, but by examining his pic, I began to feel a bit uneasy about it, especially after he failed to respond to any of my texts after the pic was sent, even the one where I asked him what would be a good time for me to check the place out. Later that night, I talked to my dad about it, and we decided to go to the address while my mom was asleep in the hotel. It was then that my suspicions proved to be true, as we were greeted with a trashy-looking trailer home with a white pickup truck parked next to it. Thankfully, it was like 2 in the morning, so he couldn't have seen us. The very next day after orientation, me and my dad explained our findings to Mom, where we decided that my enrollment at the school would be pushed back to the fall semester until I could find a proper place to stay. So from what I could guess, the guy must have thought I was an 18-year-old female looking for a place to move and that I would be checking out the place by myself. So when it was revealed that I was actually a fully grown man, he must have realized his plans to prey on a teenage girl weren't coming into fruition. To start off this story, this happened while I was in college. My sophomore year, I lived in the dorms and I was assigned to a random roommate. He seemed a little bit introverted but fairly normal at first, but he wouldn't really talk to me. I would try to start conversations about things he showed interest in, but he would only give me one-word answers that were obviously meant to end the conversation. I figured he probably just didn't like me, so I decided I would give him some space and leave him alone. After a few days, that's when it started. I would notice that he was always staring in my direction. I chalked it up to coincidence, but it continued happening. Classes started up, and I spent less and less time in the room, but whenever I was in there, he would be constantly looking in my direction. Whenever I would turn to face him, he would turn his head away from me, but it would creep me out since it was pretty much constant. I started noticing that he would lay on his bed to read, but he would always hold the book or papers at an angle that always gave him a direct line of sight to me. About a week or so into the semester, my girlfriend at the time and I went on a morning hike and crashed on my bed at around 2 p.m. We woke up to him just standing there staring at us about 2 hours later. He didn't say anything, just turned and left the room. It was at that point that I decided I needed to leave before he did something to me in my sleep. I got out of there pretty quickly. Fortunately, I didn't see him again for quite a while, but we ended up having a class together senior year. I had been telling my friends that story ever since it happened, and they didn't believe me. One of my friends had really poor vision, so we sat in the front row. Of course, every time I looked behind me, my old roommate was always staring directly at me. Not at the teacher, but at me. It didn't really matter if we were on the middle or on one of the sides. I challenged my friends to look back a single time during the semester and catch him not looking at me. Within 5 classes, they gave up, and they agreed that he was staring at me non-stop, and that he was indeed super creepy. My parents think he was in love with me, but I just think he was crazy. I guess I'll never really know what his deal was. So this happened at the end of summer of 2016. To give a bit of backstory, my boyfriend and I were both around 20 years old. So my boyfriend Max and I used to share an apartment with another married couple. Mind you, they were pretty awesome people. Unfortunately for us, Florida wasn't what they wanted, so they decided to move to Pennsylvania. Max and I started looking for people to replace them with because of rent, and it was pretty pricey, and we didn't want to have to pay for the whole thing all on our own. It was in a very nice area, but not close enough to the city, so most people that told us they would drop by to check the place out would flake out last minute. Eventually, we found this person that seemed to be a very nice and laid-back girl. She then explained to us how she was looking for a place for her boyfriend, Dan. Now, I tend to see people's auras when I meet them, and I always get a certain feeling when I don't like them immediately. I'm not a judgmental person in the slightest, it's just something I feel and can't help. I did not like this person straight off the bat, but I tried to give them the benefit of the doubt because everyone else seemed to be okay with them, so I thought I might be wrong, and I was hoping I was. As the time went by, said Dan started being super loud. He would invite people over on weeknights till 4 a.m. He would play music loud enough for it to sound like it was being played from our room, and multiple other annoying things, and also being beyond disrespectful, especially to me. Max wouldn't do anything about it, and I'm kinda glad because I know Dan would have wanted to fight him or something. Dan was 22 at the time, but he had the mentality of a 12-year-old. Side note, we later found out that Dan had some previous mugshots for shoplifting and other stuff. He also threatened to beat me up several times. Yeah, me, a 20-year-old girl. I just wanted to give you a bit of insight on Dan so you understand what is coming up. Buckle up. It was a Wednesday night, and I got home at around 5:30. As I was walking upstairs and almost to the 3rd floor, which is where we lived, I saw him coming out of the apartment, but I don't say anything because we don't like him, so I just mostly ignored him. He then started yelling at me and telling me to look at the apartment. I looked inside from the doorway and I saw nothing wrong, so I asked what he was talking about, and still in an angry voice he claimed that he had been robbed and that he had also just gotten home to this. But I saw all the furniture is there and whatnot, so I didn't really know what he was going on about. I then went inside and I noticed that my Wii U was gone, but the rest of my consoles were there. So at this point, I was already getting pretty suspicious of him. I tried to keep calm as much as I could, and I called Max to see how far from home he was. We usually both got home around the same time. As I'm calling, Dan yelled at me again that he had called the cops and that they were on their way, and in these exact words he then said,
"Do whatever you need to do, because the police are on their way."
When he told me that, I immediately knew he had been home for a while because he must have had time to hide all of his weapons and drugs and God knows what else he had. Within about 5 minutes, the cops were pulling in, and so was Max. One officer went upstairs with Dan and Max to write down everything that was missing, and the other officer stayed downstairs. I stayed with him, just chatting. According to Max, we're missing a lot of our stuff in our room, but Dan is only missing his PS4. I did ask him at last if it was possible to search Dan's car, and I also said if he needed to search my or Max's car, we'd be okay with it. He said it wasn't necessary, but agreed to search Dan's car. Once they all came back downstairs, the officers asked Dan if they could search his car and that they also needed his ID. He said he was okay with them searching his car, but that he had to get his ID and keys from the apartment. Max and I followed him upstairs. We saw him get his wallet and keys and he left the apartment. We don't want to be nosy and stay downstairs while they search his car, so we decided to stay in the apartment. A few minutes go by and he's still not downstairs with the cops, so we started looking around the neighborhood, but he had already vanished. How convenient, but since he had agreed that they could search his car and in no moment said that they couldn't, they went ahead and started looking if the car was unlocked, and it was. We found all of our stuff in his car. In the car was our 3DS, our PS4 controller, Max's laptop, some Wii U games, and a lot more. The very next morning, I decided to put all of his stuff out by the dumpster and then had a locksmith change our locks. I thought of putting a restraining order on him, but we ended up never going through with it. A few weeks later, we saw his car parked outside a few yards from our building, but we pretended like we didn't see him and we just watched him from our room with 911 ready to be dialed. Eventually he just left and he didn't cause any more problems. But still, Dan, I really hope we don't encounter you ever again. So, about 3 years ago, I was going to a school in a US city, and I was living with 2 other roommates. One of my roommates was pretty well known to usually bring seedy characters back to the apartment. At one point during our fall semester, she befriended a guy in her advertising class who went by the name of Dallas. He became her weed dealer, and she would frequently bring him over to the apartment. I suspected they were sleeping together, but she always denied it. It was a strange relationship, but who am I to judge? My other roommate and I thought he was charismatic enough, but we also didn't see the appeal that Christy saw. I remember one night when we had Dallas over for dinner. He told us how he played for our college's football team and that he started his own business at the age of 25. He was a very well-known weed dealer who made a crap ton of money, and his name was Dallas because he used to live in Dallas, Texas, and apparently that's what his parents named him after. Me and my other roommate nodded our heads and listened, but we didn't think much of it except for this dude thought he was hot stuff and wanted to gloat about himself. Mind you, he was like 5'4" and probably not over 150 pounds. I believe he came over for dinner maybe about 2 more times after that. My roommate claimed that one time she decided to buy weed from him and went to his apartment off campus. When she arrived, she saw our roommate Christy just pass the crap out on a chair in the middle of the day in Dallas's apartment in some random room. When my roommate arrived, he mentioned nothing of her being there. My roommate shook her awake and Christy just woke up in a haze and basically told my roommate to screw off. My roommate recounted the story to me, and we both agreed it was pretty freaking weird, and Dallas was probably not the safest person to hang with. After a couple of months, Christy stopped hanging out with him. I remember her saying he got pissed because she didn't want to sleep with him. I also found out that a friend of hers who knew him for a long time was engaged to him. Oh, and also, his real name wasn't Dallas. I mean, real shocker there. Fast forward 2 years. Neither me or my roommate talk to Christy anymore. We're living elsewhere in said city doing our own thing. We get an alert on our phones that a girl who had just transferred to our college went missing after leaving one of the campus bars the previous night. It doesn't take very long, maybe a few days, when this huge story breaks. Apparently, this girl was killed by someone she left the bar with that night. So I get a call from my roommate, and the call goes something like this. "Dude, do you remember what Dallas's real name was?" "Yeah, I believe it was something like Michael or something." She replies back with, "Go online and read this article. He freaking killed that girl who just went missing." Sure enough, I go online, and there is the most creepiest mugshot of Dallas, next to a photo of the girl he had just slain. Well, it gets crazier. Apparently, he had taken her home that night. I'm assuming it was a one-night stand sort of thing. So I guess at one point things turned bad and he killed her by blunt force and strangulation. And if that isn't terrible enough for you, he cleaned up the evidence in his apartment, threw her body in a storage container, and took a freaking lift to his grandma's house hours away. And then he buried the storage container with her remains in it on the property somewhere. After obtaining a video of the 2 of them leaving the bar together, it didn't take the cops very long to find him. Weeks after that story broke, so many different girls came forward and shared similar creepy stories about Dallas. The guy who played college football and ran a successful business. You can guess that none of this was ever true. Also, he was like 28 years old, claiming he was still a student at our college when this all happened, when in reality he was probably just there prying on younger women. It's truly a horrible story what happened to that young girl. Without going into too much detail, my first year in college I stayed in a suite-style room. 2 of us in one room and 2 in the other, and we shared a bathroom outside of our doors. Long story short, by the end of the year, the suite mates and I became great friends, and we alienated my roommate of the group. She ended up being a really hateful person. We decided that our second year we would try to get rooms together. We ended up only getting 2 of us in the same room, and the third person had a single. My roommate Cora was my roommate before. Now, Cora smoked a lot of weed. She couldn't go to any class without getting absolutely stoned. Now, I didn't have a problem with this, but I didn't smoke. Now, my roommate Sarah also smoked, but very little. Again, the first few weeks of our second year were great, and we had a lot of fun, and we all got along really well. That is, until Cora flipped a switch and changed completely. The first red light was when I asked her if she could cover herself when she got out of the shower. She would shower and stay completely naked and walk around the room, and I explained to her how it made me uncomfortable. She was fine with it. I didn't care if she wore a towel, but just not butt naked in the middle of the day in our tiny room. Next came the weird instances. Sarah came over quite often and slept on the floor between us, and we had a lot of laughs throughout the night. But there was one night when Sarah was awoken by someone reaching over to her very close, too close, and they were brushing her chest. She just froze and pretended she was asleep. She opened her eyes a little while later, and Cora was staring at her in the complete darkness. No phone, just staring wide awake. From here on, things just went crazy. She would scream at the top of her lungs in the shower and after because she couldn't walk around naked. She began to pluck every single pubic hair while laying in bed under her blankets, making herself bleed. She also started punching things repeatedly, and overall she made the environment extremely hostile. After a few weeks of this, I decided to spend most of my time in the study room down the hall that was only big enough for one person. Cora and Sarah were in the room, and I see Sarah run frantically down to the study room door and ask if she can come in. I waved her in, and she was in a state of complete panic. While I was in the study room, Cora had a complete breakdown. She threatened to hurt me and how she was waiting until I got back so she could strangle me. She was throwing things around the room and speaking horrible things about me and my family. Things that were so bad that Sarah wouldn't repeat them to me. She got to the point saying that she would hurt me in my sleep and strangle me while I'm studying. It was so bad that Sarah was frozen in fear. As soon as Cora left the room and decided to go eat, that's when Sarah ran to me and told me everything. Apparently, it got to the point that she actually had a pocket knife in her hand and was pacing back and forth waiting for my return. I ended up having to switch rooms, go to a safe room, and completely change my situation because she wanted to hurt me. Sarah and I are still great friends after we both transferred at the end of that year. She decided to see her about a month after I left the room, and Cora had carved the word happy into her arm and scarred herself on her upper shoulder. She repeatedly badmouthed the situation like we planned on ruining her life, when in reality it was all her. She's the one who went crazy. I really don't know what happened to her. There's a few more details that I left out, but overall this person became a complete nightmare almost overnight. Be sure to really get to know the person before you become roommates with them. You never really know who they'll turn out to be. Be careful. When I was around 7 or 8, my family and I went on holiday to Gran Canaria, one of the Canary Islands, and during this holiday we visited a rather large water park just outside of Puerto Rico. Now, this water park was big, like 4 sections with about 5 slides per area. So we were at the park having fun going down slides, but as I was young, I mainly kept to the smaller kids slides and little wave pools, and sometimes venturing to the medium slides with my dad. But after a while, my parents wanted to go to the biggest slides, so left me and my younger brother in the care of my uncle, who was playing with my cousin in the kids pool. I tell my uncle that I was going to go to the medium slides, which were in viewing distance from the kids pool, so he allowed it, and off I went. After a while, I thought I would go back to the kids' pool where our loungers were to check up with my uncle and see if my parents had returned. But when I got back, nothing. I couldn't find anyone, and me being 7 at the time, I began to panic a bit while going off in the direction at the big slides to find my parents. After a while of walking about, probably looking a little distressed, a kind of chubby but not overweight English man comes up to me. He asked if I'm okay. At first he seemed nice and he offered to help me look for my mom and dad, but me being brought up the way that I was, I told him that he was a stranger and that I wasn't allowed to talk to him. I then walked off, still on my search. A few minutes later I see him again. In hindsight, he was probably following me, and he approaches me again and offers to take me for popcorn and a drink while I waited for my parents, to which again I say no, as my mom says I'm not allowed to go off with strangers. It was at this point when I see a lifeguard, and I walk over to him for some help. I talk to the lifeguard saying that I need to find my parents, and that we were over by the kids' area when the man again appears and begins telling the lifeguard that he's a family friend and that he would take me back to where we were. The lifeguard caught on to my face, and he could tell that the man was lying. He asked if I know the man, to which I said no, and the lifeguard offers to walk me back to where my family was, which I obviously take up, as I'm now a bit scared of the strange man. The lifeguard takes me back to our sunbeds where my mom and dad were, and I could tell that my mom was upset, which I will elaborate on later. Anyway, the lifeguard tells my parents what happened and that he'll look out for the guy so he doesn't bother us again. I don't remember much after getting lost in the park and the now creepy guy. So when I was old enough to understand, my mom told me why she was so upset when they didn't know where I was, other than the fact that their son was just gone. Earlier that year in Portugal, the very real disappearance of a girl really hit the UK in a big way, and many people were fearful of going abroad on holiday. I sometimes think about how I could have been the second little kid to go missing that year, and even though it's been over 10 years, to that creepy guy at the water park, I really hope I never encounter you ever again. This happened when I was around the age of 14 to 15. The story involves myself, my sister who I'll call S for the sake of the story, and the creeper in question who we'll call Carl. I went to a theme park called Great America with my older sister who was around the age of 17 to 18 at the time. S pestered me to go onto a ride that I was not comfortable riding at the time, until I finally budged and said I'd go with her. While we stood in line, S and I heard Carl yelling about his favorite sports team to seemingly nobody. He was with a group of girls, so we assumed he was just having a good time with his friends, but that was not the case. Anyway, S and I got on the ride from start to finish. The ride itself was a pirate ship that basically swung back and forth, similar to a pendulum, and eventually started to do complete circles, causing passengers to temporarily hang upside down. The ride itself isn't really that key to the story, besides the fact that I was nauseous after the ride. After the ride finished, I noticed that the girls that were previously with Carl left him while yelling that he was a weirdo. I didn't really pay much attention to them because my stomach was acting up, but I guess I really should have. At the time, S and I were standing on top of a bridge, and I told S that I needed a minute. I walked over to the railing of the bridge and leaned over to get some fresh air. Basically just breathing stuff, really. This is where the story gets weird. While leaning over the railing, I feel big arms suddenly wrap around my waist, and then I'm being held up in the air. Initially, I am freaking out, and I'm trying to comprehend what is actually happening to me in that moment. All I really know is that I'm in the air, and I'm not exactly sure why. I thought that whoever was holding me was going to throw me over the bridge, but instead, they just put me on the ground. I instantly whip around to see Carl standing there and smiling at me. S runs over to stand beside me and asks Carl why he lifted me in the air. I was sorta in a state of shock at the time, and I couldn't really speak. The following conversation then ensued. So, why did you lift him up into the air like that?
He looked like he was sick and needed some fresh air.
Tell me how lifting someone into the air is going to help them with a sickness. Carl ignores the question, looks at me, and asks how I'm doing. I ignored the question and just continued to look away from him since my sister was doing all the talking.
Come on, kid, look at someone when they speak to you. You bored or something? I bet you're bored going on rides with your, friend, sibling? It doesn't matter. I heard her screaming her lungs out on that ride we all just went on, and I bet she doesn't want to go on any more of the scary rides. Yeah, she's no fun. You'll probably have to go home soon because of her.
Note: my sister was screaming a lot on the ride, but she told me that she screams on rides because it raises her adrenaline levels, which causes her to have more fun. My sister then said, "Leave him alone. What we do is none of your business."
Oh, but it is. I want everyone that comes to this park to have a good time. I mean, it's Great America. Tell you what, kid, how about you and I go to the water park and ditch your little friend here? She's not going to have much fun getting wet anyway, but trust me, we will. We can both go on all the water slides that you want, and afterwards I can take you out to wherever you want to go for some lunch.
Now, I don't know what you think about an old random man asking a 14 to 15-year-old kid to go out with them, but I instantly thought that this dude was trying to kidnap me. So I feel that this guy is a danger to myself and possibly yes, so I made a movement to walk away from him. Carl suddenly stepped in front of me to block my path of exit, so I had to think of another way that we could get past him. I feigned getting a phone call from my parents and then say, "Hi Mom, oh yeah, me and my sister and I were just getting off the pirate ship ride." "What? You're waiting right outside? Okay, we'll be right there. See you soon." I said it in a loud enough voice that Carl could hear everything that transpired, and with my newfound confidence, I pushed right past Carl. S and I walked past Carl in the direction that my feigned mother was waiting at. After we both walked for about 10 to 15 seconds, we broke out in a sprint until we reached the park entrance. We tried to tell the front desk people about the weird guy, but they said since nothing really happened, they couldn't really do anything. So to the creepy old man who literally picked me up, if you happen to ever see me again, please stay away from me. This happened when I was around 11 or 12 years old during the summer holidays. I'm male, and at the time I was about 5 feet tall, out of shape, and very shy. I was traveling with my parents in Europe, as we had been to Barcelona and Paris before, with our next destination being Tarragona in Spain, where an amusement park called Port Aventura was located. We had scheduled to stay there in one of the hotels for 4 days to visit the park, water park, and beach club. Now, the story I'm about to tell happened on the 3rd day in the main park. It was getting late, and most of the areas of the park were closed except for the Mediterranean area, as a show with fountains, lights, and fireworks was being held over the lake that night, as it was the week of the park's anniversary. I asked my parents if we could stay and watch the show, but they were much too tired after an entire day of running around the amusement park, and needed to go to the information desk to make sure the things that we had bought were properly sent to our hotel room. I begrudgingly obliged. As we were at the information center, I felt the need to go to the bathroom. I asked my mother if I could go and where the nearest one was. As it turns out, the closest one to us is at the edge of the Mediterranean area. My parents were busy at the info desk and I have no siblings, so they just told me to go alone. I wish I had waited for them to be done so I could have gone with my dad, because what transpired next was completely traumatizing. So I navigated back to the Mediterranean area and to the bathrooms. The whole area was pretty busy, and lots of people were crowded by the edge of the lake to watch the show that was just about to begin. I entered the bathroom and went on with my business at a urinal. That is, until I noticed a man looking towards me. I normally don't like it when people stare at me, as I was shy, but this time instead of being embarrassed, I felt in danger. I glanced back at the man. He was about 6 feet tall, about mid-20s with a well-built physique, very short hair, almost shaved, Caucasian, wearing a gray hoodie, dark blue jeans, and black leather boots. It immediately struck me as this was the kind of person you wouldn't expect to see at an amusement park. He was standing in front of the second urinal as if using it, but I had the feeling he wasn't. I noticed him glancing over at me a few more times. I was done and eager to leave. I tried to pass behind him, and as I did, I noticed him reach for me. I barely managed to avoid his hand, and then he grunted while I made a whimpering noise. The bathroom was very crowded, so no one noticed it. As I neared the exit, he then left his urinal. I left the restrooms and looked over at the lake. The show had started. There were images being displayed on the water of the fountains with a projector, and loud music was being blasted on all of the speakers. I tried to blend into the crowd, hoping to lose him. After about a minute of making my way through the cluster of people, I looked back. Not 10 meters behind me, there he was, following behind me through the same path between the herd that I had cut through. He now had his hood up, covering his face, but I could feel him staring me down. I also noticed that he was now wearing what I think were black fingerless gloves. Alarms were totally going off in my head, as my previous stance on this situation went from weird and creepy to now dangerous. I then turned and started to desperately get to an area I could run away in. After about 15 more seconds of squeezing through the people, I reached the final stretch of the lakeside pathway. It was empty, too far away from the main show for anyone to be there, yet the speakers were still playing very loudly there. Up ahead was a maintenance side path with the gate slightly ajar. To the left was a turn leading back to the plaza with the Info Central building. I run as fast as my asthmatic out-of-shape self could go towards the turn. I could hear this man running behind me, his boots getting louder and louder behind me. He was gaining on me. I started to panic and ran even faster than I ever thought I could, but he was still getting closer. I had reached the turn and changed direction so fast that I leaned towards the ground and nearly slipped. I felt motion behind me as if someone had taken a swing at me, and I could hear the man complain in a language that I didn't recognize. My working theory is that it was Russian, but I don't really know for sure. I kept running through the plaza directly to the information building, but I didn't hear the man running after me anymore. I turned around and saw him slip into the service gate at the end of the street. I ran inside the building and grabbed my mom's leg, stuttering and almost crying, but she was too occupied with the lady at the counter, and though she saw me distressed, she told me to go sit and wait and then tell her when we left. I tried to protest, but she wouldn't listen and was paying keen attention to the lady. As I walked over to sit on one of the chairs, I looked out the door and scanned the plaza with my eyes. I didn't really notice anything at first and almost looked away, but I began to see something behind a direction sign posted next to a tree. It was in the remote and darker corner of the plaza. It was the man. It felt like we had made direct eye contact. I turned away and sat in the chair furthest from the entrance. When we were leaving, I looked over in the same direction again, and he wasn't there anymore. I told my parents, but since I had a vivid imagination as a kid, they chalked it up to me being paranoid because I was alone, and that even if it were real, there were way too many witnesses for someone to try and pull something like that off. I wasn't too happy being called a liar about this, but considering how thick-skulled my parents can be, I didn't insist. I was just happy to be gone unscathed. I had tried to forget this encounter and was successful, but having run into so many stories and other similar stories of near kidnappings, this resurfaced in my mind and I decided to post it. As I was typing my story out, I realized how bad my situation really was. The people around at the time were distracted by the show, so no one would have seen me get taken, and with the loud music, no one would have heard me scream or struggle. And the fact that the maintenance gate was open and saw the man enter it, that means I almost ran into right where he wanted me. To think that I almost got kidnapped right next to a crowd of people totally boggles my mind. I now never wander alone in amusement parks anymore, even to use the bathroom. I worked at Six Flags around last spring/summer. I was 18 at the time and attending college. I was one of the oldest people hired while most of my coworkers were in high school. I took photos in a sort of old-timey dress-up shop. It was honestly one of the most fun jobs I'd ever had. I was hired back in March 2018 and started work in April when the park was open on weekends only before the official opening. I had been working for about a month and the park was now open during the week for less than 10 hours per day, so I was able to work all day but was unfortunately the only one in the shop as college was on summer break and high school was still in session until mid-June. You can see where this story is going. I was alone all day during the week and had some coworkers on the weekends. I was so terribly alone during the day that I'd walk across the path to go see my other coworker out of boredom. When I was outside of my shop during the day, I began to notice a man hanging around my area. I'd mainly see him walk by very slowly staring at me the whole time. I figured he was just shy, wanted a picture inside, and was too afraid or socially awkward to ask for pricing. Deep down, he gave me an uneasy feeling, but I decided to ignore it because he was a customer in the park and was probably just very antisocial. I kept a smile and tried pulling in customers all day every day. One day, I decided to smile and wave at him. Now, that was probably my biggest mistake. He walked over briskly to stand in front of me and stare at me. I was creeped out. I was scared. He then asked about prices after days of walking by me and staring. I breathed a sigh of relief and started going through my memorized sales pitch. After I finished, he started to smile. Not a normal smile, one that made my skin crawl. He leaned in so close to me that I could smell his breath. He asked how much it would be for him. I was really confused as I'd just gone through my price list, so I stated that the prices were set in stone and non-negotiable, unless you happen to be an art company employee or a park employee. He then shrugged and walked off. When I ran through my pitch, a family had grown interested and wanted some pictures, so I gladly took them into the shop and had a wonderful time photographing them. While I was checking the family out and collecting the payment, I looked up and the man was back, leaning against the chain barrier in front of my shop. The family collected their things and walked to the chain. The man had to move to the side for me to open it for them. I immediately closed it behind them as he tried pushing his way in the shop. I told him I was sorry, but only paying customers could come in. He wasn't allowed in unless he was considering a purchase. He then frowned and walked away. I waited a few minutes, tidied up the shop, and stepped back outside. It was almost closing time, so it was pointless, but I had to stand outside or else I'd get in trouble with my boss. I noticed him one last time that day. Across the way from me was a game, and I saw him hiding behind it, peeking his head out and looking at me. I can't begin to tell you how scared I was. I wanted to cry. He continued to do this for the entire week, and I eventually began to ignore him, which he did not like. On that Friday, as soon as the park opened, he made a beeline towards me. I was out front organizing outdoor props, and I froze. I hastily dropped what I was doing and went inside, closing the chain behind me. He paced back and in front of the chain, muttering to himself and looking at me. I was so terrified I was going to run to the phone and call security if he didn't leave. He suddenly lurched forward, grabbing the chain in both of his hands. I will never forget this moment because my heart stopped and my blood ran cold. His eyes were wild, and that same menacing grin that he had before was now back. He started whispering about things he wanted me to do to him. It was disgusting. He was talking about how he loved me and all of the sexual things that he wanted to do to me. He wanted me to put him in a dress and said that he wanted me to humiliate him in front of all the people in the park. I was slowly backing up to the wall in my shop as he started yelling and laughing. I told him to go away and that I would call security if he didn't leave right away. He got even more angry than before, and then he said something that keeps me up at night even a year later.
I'll be waiting for you when you get out. Meet me by the employee exit on the way out or else.
He gave me that disgusting smile and walked away. I went behind the counter and started sobbing. I never imagined I'd have something like this happen to me, and now that it had, all of my knowledge of what to do went out the window. I was crying like a little girl. I decided to tell my manager at the end of the day because I didn't want to be afraid of coming to work anymore. When I told him, he was mortified that I hadn't told him sooner. He walked me to a secret exit to the employee parking lot so I wouldn't see the man. The next morning, we went to the security office and I gave a description to all of park security of what the man looked like and what he would normally wear. I went back to my shop with 2 coworkers, and not even 5 minutes later, here he came, strolling over with an angry look on his face. I hadn't met up with him like he wanted, and he was furious. My coworkers noticed my panic as I began to run and hide in the back. I hadn't told them of my situation yet, but when I did, they told me they wouldn't leave me alone even after their shift was over, seeing how I was the closer and they didn't want me to be left alone. I called security and I told them what he was wearing, so they updated information. They posted a security officer outside of my shop. He seemed to disappear because of that. When the officer left to take care of something, he came back. Security realized that every time a clothed officer was around, he would hide. So they decided to post a plainclothes officer across from my shop posing as a customer. I was ultimately being used as bait, but I felt it was important to get him out of the park. Security eventually apprehended him later that day as he was headed towards my shop. They asked me for identification on him, and I remember breaking down and sobbing. The officer comforted me. finally this nightmare was over. He never physically threatened me or wielded a weapon, but he was doing enough verbal threats to make me fear for my life. They banned him from all of the Six Flags parks all around the country, revoked his membership status, and took him into custody. Unfortunately, since he didn't really commit any kind of violent crime, they had to let him go. As I drove home that night, I saw him walking on the side of the road, and I immediately sped away in fear he would see me through the window and begin to chase me. At least he couldn't get to me at work anymore. I found out a couple of weeks later from one of my security friends that he saw my stalker being arrested in a town over. I decided to go and look up arrest records for that town later in the day, and I saw that he'd been arrested for indecent exposure, public endangerment, and public intoxication. I know what happened to me is not as severe as other stories, but it was one of the most terrifying weeks of my life. You really don't think something like this will happen to you until it does. Please, everyone, always notice who's around you at all times and be cautious of everybody. You never know what someone's intentions are. I lived in Japan for around 10 months a couple of years back as a part of a study abroad program as my placement year for university. I lived in Hiroshima, and pretty much every Japanese person I met was exactly how you would expect them. Generous and respectful. All except this one old lady who just so happened to live in the apartment next to me. It was about a month after I'd been in Japan when our group decided we were going to the sake festival. For those who don't know, this is a huge sake drinking festival that, from what I now understand, that everyone goes and gets extremely drunk at. As men of fine taste and culture, we sampled many different kinds of sake from all over Japan, and got rode off beyond belief. Then we all got the train home back to our apartments. I can't really remember anything apart from calling my girlfriend at the time and passing out on my futon. Normal stuff. Skip to 6 a.m. the next morning when my loudest crap doorbell wakens me up. I check the time and I'm just confused as anything, but I assume it's just my friend from downstairs who wants to talk about last night. I look through the peephole in my door and I see a police officer just standing there. The first thought that goes through my mind is, Taylor, what the crap have you done when you were drunk last night? But at the same time, I was so sure I just fell asleep right away. I talked to the dude using a translation app, and he basically tells me there's been a noise complaint. I thought this was strange considering the fact that all I did was make a phone call and fall right asleep. Anyway, the guy sees how confused I am and kinda just sees there must have been a mistake, and then he leaves. I'm honestly still drunk and just super confused, but the day carries on as normal. The next morning at 6 a.m., the doorbell rings. I already kind of assumed what it was going to be this time, and what do I see through the peephole this time? 2 police officers. Same convo goes down, and I convince them that there's been no noise. I literally walk them into my apartment to show them how I fell asleep watching Netflix. They tell me at this point that it's the neighbor who I've never met, and they're making complaints. At this point, I think she's just being mean, or maybe she's a racist. I asked the guy at my uni who takes care of all the foreign students all about this. He tells me that I'm getting moved to a different apartment to a room on the floor below. I'm pretty pissed off because I'd literally just settled into my new space, but whatever. He plans on coming tomorrow morning with the landlord to move all of my crap out and to check that my room is okay. Ever been woken up by something in the middle of the night and it really messes you up? I went to sleep on good time that night and prepped for the people helping to move my stuff out. So naturally, around 3 a.m. I'm fast asleep. Then suddenly my doorbell is just constantly ringing. It's freaking deafening, and of course it's woken me up straight away. I can't even begin to tell you how scared I was. I couldn't even move, and I didn't want to. After about a minute of what felt like non-stop noise, there was complete silence. I make my way over to the front door to look through the peephole, and I see nothing, but I just know it's this psycho crazy neighbor. Nothing else happens for the rest of that night, and I eventually get back to sleep. I wake up the next morning still kinda shaken, but it's cool because my boys are coming round soon. I keep walking out the front to check if they're downstairs and quickly closing my door behind me because I don't know what this woman will try if she sees me. I walk into my room and the slide door to my balcony is wide open, and there I see her for the first time. This woman literally wrapped her freaking body all around the fence that separates our balconies, all whilst keeping her footing on her side, and is just staring right at me. We stare at each other for a second, and then she quickly whips back around to her side. Literally 2 seconds later, my doorbell rings. At this point, I'm just like, nah, that's not possible. Thank God. It turns out to be the people to help move my stuff, and I tell them what's up and hastily move downstairs to my new room. At one point, I saw the crazy lady outside and pointing to my new room and asking the police if they had come there. I was able to avoid her from that point on. I guess the police decided to start ignoring her calls. This happened to me back when I was around 12 years old. I was going through some of my old cringy notebooks and journals with my girlfriend, and I found my old journal entry where I wrote about this day, and all the memories came flooding back to me. I used to live in what I thought was a really safe and secure private community. I wasn't allowed to just wander around too far from home without supervision, but because our neighborhood was a gated community, my parents would let me walk around within the gates anytime that I wanted, even if they weren't home. One day I was riding around the neighborhood after school when I saw a middle-aged woman crying on the floor of her porch with the front door wide open. I was pretty concerned and got off my bike to see what was wrong. She said that she was having problems with her husband and immediately asked me to come in so I could keep her company while she calmed down. My stranger danger sirens were completely going off, so I declined. She kept pushing me. Please, just for a moment. I just need someone to talk to. Now, I was raised to always respect elders and to be a good person, but I was also raised to know about stranger danger. So being a young naive kid, I actually felt pretty conflicted about whether I should go in or not. Ultimately, I declined repeatedly enough that she instead asked me to wait outside with her and then sit with her until she felt better. I agreed to this since I felt very safe in my own neighborhood. She asked me to wait on the porch for her while she walked into the house and visibly grabbed a couple of framed pictures from off the wall. She then sat down next to me inside the house while I was sitting on the porch just outside of her door. She then started showing me the pictures. One was of a kid older than me in the local high school football uniform, and the other of a man and the same kid. She went on to tell me these stories about how she met him and how they spent their honeymoon in Hawaii and how her kid was so good at football, one of the best on his team. She was very worried that if her and her husband got a divorce, she wouldn't be able to see her kid anymore. And then she started bawling again, this time onto my shoulder. This actually caused me to let my guard down quite a bit. For some reason, once I knew she had a kid, I felt a bit more comfortable around her. She was talking for a while though, and I was beginning to start to feel a little awkward as she was on and off crying on my shoulder, and I didn't know how to react in the situation. What the heck did I get myself into? I kept thinking to myself as I nodded my head pretending to listen. I was more concerned about finding a good excuse to tell her I had to go home. She kept calling me such a young nice boy and telling me, "You have no idea how important it is for you to spend your time with me," which made me feel a little bad about just leaving her. She kept telling me that she wanted to reward me and make me some dinner if I just came in, which I continued to decline. Finally, I told her I had to go, and she asked me if I knew anything about how to turn on her cell phone, as she just got her first cell phone very recently. I told her I did and I could help her out before I left. She told me to wait yet again, and this time left for quite a while. I kept thinking I should just walk away, but part of me didn't want to be rude, especially since she lived right around the corner from my house and possibly even knew my parents. My anxiety levels would spike as I got closer and closer in my head to convincing myself to just stand up and walk away. Then it would just dissipate and I'd tell myself, no, I can't just leave. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, she brought me her phone, which was an Android. I had only had an iPhone 3G at the time, and it was my first smartphone, so I was a little worried that I wouldn't know how it worked. I just held the power button down for a second and lo and behold, it booted right up. She asked me then if I knew how to check text messages. I found and opened up the Messages app and there was only one number not saved as a contact in the app. She then pointed to it and said, "That's him. That's my husband's number. Read me his text. I open it up. She had received basically the same text over and over again. Just multiple variations on hello and please respond. She angrily said to me, read them to me right now. I want to know what he said to me. I then tell her. They basically all just say hello with a question mark. She just reaffirmed in a stern voice, read them to me. I started reading them. Hello, hello, please respond. She just has her eyes closed and she's nodding sometimes, commenting with things along the lines of, that jerk, he does miss me. Well, screw him. He had his chance. She then turned quickly from this crying, distraught woman who was worried about her husband leaving her into an angry and spiteful person who felt like she was in the right. There was a couple of times when I stopped reading and I would ask if she wanted me to stop, and she would just snap at me, keep reading. Then I would continue. I started to feel like her husband was a crazy person with this many messages. I must have scrolled and read dozens of messages almost identical, spanning back days. My heart was racing. I felt like I was involved in something I shouldn't be involved in. I really wanted to go home, but every time I stopped, she would get really angry and tell me to keep going. That's when I came across the very first message that wasn't hello. Stop messaging me, you crazy woman. Leave me alone. I've reported you to the police and got a restraining order. If you come anywhere near my family, you will be arrested. My heart sank. That's when I realized all the messages I had been reading so far were being sent from her phone. I paused in shock, and she again snapped at me. Keep reading. I told her I couldn't because it was getting very late and my parents had dinner for me. She again just said, why don't you just come in for dinner? I'll make you something. You can let them know later you are helping your neighbor. They won't be mad, I promise. Only this time she was a mixture of angry and desperate. I told her they would be worried and wonder why I was gone for so long. She pleaded a couple more times for me to not leave her, and she started crying as I stood up. Honestly, I felt really bad about it at the time. I rode my bike home as quickly as I could. My parents had just gotten home from work a little while ago and asked me where I was. I didn't tell them the truth because honestly I was a little worried that they wouldn't let me hang around the neighborhood when they weren't home anymore. A few days later I came home and there were 3 police cars out in front of her house. My heart sank. I asked my parents later that night if they knew what had happened. My dad just said, oh, there was just a break-in or something. I later asked one of my neighbors to see if I could get some more information about what happened. Apparently one of my neighbors fell in love with a homeless woman after inviting her in for a shower and a place to stay. He got her some new clothes and a phone and was trying to help her get a job. Turns out the reason she was homeless was because she suffered from mental illness. He then kicked her out when she started having delusions of his kid from a previous marriage being her kid as well. Honestly, he sounds like a really crappy person. She began harassing him after this, so he left the house to his parents' house and then sent the kid to his ex-wife's house. Apparently, he was worried for his ex-wife and his kid's safety. He had every right to because shortly after he left, she broke a rear window of his house and then came in. She had been living in the house for nearly a week before a neighbor noticed the broken window and called the police. She apparently trashed the whole house by that point and was arrested. I almost didn't believe it, but I went behind the house and saw the broken window. I guess the guy broke his lease and moved out immediately because he was worried she would come back after getting out of jail. I don't know if she ever did try and come back, but I really hope they disclose this to the new tenants. Honestly, I still get pretty freaked out to this day. Who knows what would have happened if I went into that house. This story happened in summer of 2017. I was working at a pharmacy, and I had been there for about 4 years. A new staff pharmacist around the same age as me, 28, was hired. He seemed pretty odd, but I was nice to him because everyone else was rude to him immediately, and I felt really bad. He asked me way too many questions. Some I answered and others crossed boundaries. Fast forward about a month, he said that he was moving. He lived on the east side of my city, and he said that he was moving to the west side where I live. He said that he actually found a house near the intersection of where I live. I asked him which street, and he wouldn't tell me. He also said that the owner will live there for a few more months, so I forgot about it. Fast forward a few months later, and my mom and stepdad told me that they met our new neighbor. My mom said that he seemed like a really nice young man. The next time I worked with him, I asked if that was him, and he said no. I let it go for a little bit. Then another time he started asking me questions, describing my backyard and asking if my street name started with the letter that it did, so he admitted it was him. I asked him how he knew it was my house. He said that he saw me in the backyard, but he decided not to say anything to me. The next few months were weird. I was still friendly with him as a coworker, but he crossed some boundaries. He knew my birthday was coming up, and my brother was asking for ideas of what to get me. I wanted a certain phone case, so I was browsing on my phone to send my brother links to the ones I wanted. He would always look over my shoulder when I was on my phone. He saw the type of phone case. He got me the phone case and a $150 preloaded Visa gift card. I then told him in a very professional manner that I felt the gift was inappropriate and probably against company policy. I walked over to his mailbox while he was at work to return it. He kept putting it back in my mailbox with messages of begging me to accept it because I make him so happy. I ended up giving it away. Not much longer after that happened, I took my female coworker to the zoo. I had posted some of it on my story on Snapchat. He kept messaging me on Snapchat asking me questions about it, and it was bothering me, so I decided to block him. After that, he called my mother and told her that he needed to talk to her. He told her he needed to come over and talk to her, so she invited him in and they talked. I was very alarmed by this, but my mom thought it was endearing. I told him once again at work that he crossed boundaries, and he said that he does everything he does because he cares about me. He didn't understand where I was coming from at all. Those were the most standout things he has done. Also a lot of pestering about,
tell me who your boyfriend is,
and trying to look at pictures in my phone to figure it out, and also going through coworkers' phones and reading their conversations with me. Even impersonating them while I was not at work to get info. One time he even cornered me at work and he wouldn't leave me alone until I told him what characteristics I look for in a guy. He was also mad at me when he saw that I got a birth control prescription filled, even though it was only being used to correct hormonal problems from another birth control. I started being mean to him at work because I couldn't take it anymore. He told me that I was being mean to him because he's a nice guy who cares about me, and that I'm looking for a jerk. It became a very hostile work environment, and I left about 2 months ago. This is a side note. Other coworkers and neighbors absolutely hate him because he likes to start confrontations. He also likes to play he said she said with people for entertainment. The neighbors have called the police on him and they think he's crazy. I haven't heard from him at all since leaving. I saw my former coworker last week at a get-together, and she said that he's trying to get her to tell him where I work now. He told her that he sees me getting into my car every morning, so he knows I have a job. I told my mom this and she didn't take it seriously. I would just really like to get an outside perspective. Whenever I come home late, I always run to the door, and if no one is home, I will always wait to take a shower. I'm still really scared. The story happened to me years ago, but it still affects me to this day. The summer after I graduated high school, I was still living at home with my family. I was up one late night and was packing for a camping trip with my friends. It was unbelievably hot, and I had the window open as I sat and folded my clothes. It was around 2 in the morning, and the next thing I knew, there was a hand coming through the gap in the screen of my window. I screamed, and the hand flew back out. I was stunned, but there was a part of me that wondered if it was my younger brother pranking me. I got up and looked out the window and just saw a figure of a man. He was staring at me. I ran into my brother's room, and he was there playing video games. We called the police, who came and searched the area. They didn't find anything, and they warned me and my parents to lock all of the windows and doors, and then they left. We were all still shaken up, and my mom had a feeling that he would come back. It turns out her mother's intuition was right. She went outside and waited on our back porch. After about 20 minutes or so, she saw the man dressed in black slink into our backyard along the tree line. He hid behind a tree for a few seconds and ran to another tree and hid there, slowly working his way toward my window. My mother yelled something to him and he took off running. The police came back out again, but they found no trace of him. I never opened that window ever again, not even the curtains. My parents had installed some motion detecting lights, and that seemed to be the end of that. About 6 months later, my friend and I got an apartment downtown together. We were really excited as this was our first place all on our own. The apartment wasn't exactly the best quality, but it was so fun to be living in the city, and again, all on our own. The downside was that it was street parking only. After a few weeks, my car was broken into. Nothing was taken but a single rose sat on the passenger seat. It was pretty creepy, but I vowed to be vigilant and safe. I always tried to park close to the entrance near the lights, but often it was difficult to get those spots, and I would often have to park further away on darker streets. Things quickly began escalating at this point. My car was broken into at least once a week. Most of the time a flower was left, which I always threw on the ground, but once there was a pair of men's underwear left. And even more creepily, once a bag of Tootsie Rolls, as they were my favorite candy. This made me wonder if the person doing this knew me personally, and I started to become really suspicious and paranoid of everyone. There was a laundry area in the basement of the apartment, and one day I went down to get a load that finished drying. As I started to fold them, I realized all of my undergarments, bras, and panties were gone. I mean, they were completely just gone. Another week I had a male friend over from school and his tire got slashed during the visit. By the time the first letter arrived, I had already started making plans to move elsewhere. The letter described a love for me that had been going on for years. He began to note things that proved he had been watching me very closely. I was able to arrange for another friend to take over my lease, and I moved in with another friend on the other side of the city. It was a secured building and had an underground parking garage that was only accessible to tenants. I felt much more secure, and the extra money spent was well worth the peace of mind. Things were quiet for a few months, and then my roommate got a boyfriend. Most of us were wary of Ashley's new boyfriend from the beginning. For one, they met on MySpace after he reached out to her. Another reason was that the new boyfriend, Matt, was extremely good looking. And while Ashley was a wonderful person, she just wasn't the type you would typically expect to date someone like him. Ashley was thrilled. She had never had a boyfriend and had really felt like he was her Prince Charming. I thought he was weird and creepy from the beginning. Matt was on the quiet side and he always seemed to be sporting an uncomfortable, leering smile. It was difficult to carry on any sort of conversation with him because he would always make it weird with some kind of random fact that was completely unrelated to what we were talking about. I had deleted my MySpace when the initial stalking began, but I created a dummy account to learn more about Matt. It didn't look like he really knew any of his friends in real life. There were only pictures of himself, and the rest of the information was vague. My friends and I gently tried to discourage her from dating Matt. He technically hadn't done anything wrong, but he was just strange. She would immediately get defensive and would shut the conversation down immediately. Matt started to spend more time at the apartment, and I found myself finding any excuse I could to avoid coming home. One day I came home from work and I found Matt on my couch alone drinking a beer. Ashley had been called into work and she told him he could just hang out until she got home. I was furious because I didn't want to spend any time with him, so I grabbed a beer and a snack and headed off to my room and shut the door. After about 30 minutes or so, he knocked on my door and suggested we watch some TV and get to know each other better because we both loved Ashley. I didn't want to, but decided that maybe I needed to give it a try. Give him the benefit of the doubt, if you will. He put on a movie and I tried to just focus on the movie because I didn't want to talk. At one point I glanced over to Matt and he was just staring at me with a smile on his face. I snapped a, "What? What are you looking at?" at him, and he just continued smiling and said,
"I don't know. I just can't believe it."
"You can't believe what?" I asked. He then said nothing and went back to watching the movie, still smiling. I had no idea what he was talking about, but the interaction had every hair standing up on my body. I then excused myself and then locked the door to my room. Another month or so went on, and I had managed to avoid being home for anything other than sleep and showering. Matt practically lived there now, and he had even brought a bunch of his things into Ashley's room. I really didn't want to move again, but I was beginning to look for other options. On their 6-month anniversary, I saw a huge bouquet of flowers on the table, and an already open card propped right next to it. I rolled my eyes and was about to leave when I decided to see what the weirdo wrote to her. When I opened the card, my heart started beating through my chest. Without even reading the words he wrote, I was shaking. The handwriting was exactly the same as the one my stalker had sent. I had kept them as evidence and dug them out of my desk for comparison. The handwriting was unique and identical. Matt was indeed the stalker. I called the police first. As they were on the way, I called Ashley and I asked her to come over immediately. She said she was at work, but said she would be there when she could. I was really freaked out to tell her because I knew she would be shattered. The police took a statement from me and actually went to Ashley's work to get more information from her, and they ended up breaking the news. Apparently, Ashley called Matt and left a furious message, even though the cops told her not to say anything, and he completely disappeared after that. There was no Matt or anyone matching his resemblance at the place he said he worked. Ashley had never been to his apartment because he said he had been staying with friends while trying to save money for a trip to Europe. His family lived out of state and she had never even met any of his friends. He said they had a falling out because he was choosing to spend so much time with Ashley. In the end, it was all lies. She was dating a stranger. We honestly don't even know if Matt was his real name. The cherry on top of this whole thing was when we went through Matt's things. He had left all of his things when he disappeared, and Ashley and I decided to go through all of his stuff. There was a duffel bag that was full of gym clothes, but in one of the compartments there was about 10 pictures of me. All of them were taken far away with the exception of one of me sleeping. The sheets were current, so I know it had to have been at the current apartment before I started locking my bedroom door. A few of the pictures dated back to before the incident at my parents' house, which made us think that that was him as well. 2 pairs of my missing underwear were there, and I shuddered to think of what he did with the rest. A Starbucks lid with my red lipstick marks, a necklace I hadn't even noticed missing, a few other random sick souvenirs. It was so creepy. Unfortunately, the police were never able to track him down. I decided to accept an opportunity overseas that I'd been considering, and I got the heck out of there as soon as I could. Unfortunately, Ashley and I quickly drifted apart. She had a really hard time accepting that her first love was a complete psycho. I think I had some underlying anger for believing all of his lies and letting him into our lives. I didn't know what his end game was. Would he have tried to hurt me, or was he just simply content with being involved in my world? I guess I'll never know. Being stalked changes you. Even when I lived across the world, I looked over my shoulder everywhere I went. To this day, I still have no social media accounts attached to my real name. If I had to guess, he's probably messing with some new woman now. But every time I visit my hometown, I am tense to keep a low profile. Part of me will always worry that Matt will resurface again, but I really hope that never happens. When I was about 12 or 13, my mom and dad owned a tow trucking company. This particular day, they went to our neighboring state, so I had a few friends over, and we were there alone. They probably came over at about 12 p.m. in the afternoon. We were doing the normal preteen stuff, watching movies, eating junk food, etc. It was winter, so it started to get dark pretty fast. We were expecting my mom and dad to come home around 6 or 7. A little before my mom and dad were supposed to be home, there was a knock on my door. The way my house was set up was the front door was right next to my living room couch where all of us were hanging out. Anywho, my mom is known for kinda being stuck in the 80s. She always wore a black leather jacket. One of my friends, let's call her Tina, looks through the window of the door and then says, "Hey, it's your mom. I think I see her jacket." I jump up immediately and look through my window. At this time, it's pretty dark, and I don't see my father's tow truck. I run to the front door screaming to Tina, "Don't answer the door, it's not my mom." But I was too late. She opens the door, and here comes this 6-foot, 250-pound man with a black stocking over his face running through my door. All of my friends ran out of my living room to the kitchen where the back door is and ran away. Me, on the other hand, I obviously learned that day that my fight, flight, or freeze is to freeze. This man grabs a hold of me and then picks me up in the air. I was so scared that I actually peed my pants. I kind of don't remember how it happened, but I managed to escape his grips and run out my back door down the block to a neighbor's house. We called the cops, and within a couple of minutes there were 6 cop cars, 3 on each end of the block. Come to find out, it was one of my grown neighbors. He allegedly was playing a trick on us, a bunch of little girls. He always was a creep. I'm now 26. To this day, whenever there's a knock on my door, I literally creep around my house so that people can't hear or see me, and I hide until they're gone. This happened a little bit ago, about a month, and it was a bizarre experience to say the least. I'm 15 years old, and I was playing some video games before passing out. It was about, say, 11 p.m. when I hear the doorbell ring. Out of instinct, I begin walking downstairs, but about halfway there, rationality came to mind. Who the heck rings a doorbell at 11 p.m.? I silently strode back upstairs and stood in the hall, kinda expecting something bad to happen. An exact minute later, it rings twice. My parents begin to leave their room and give me a quizzical look, and all I had to respond with was a shrug. Then he starts banging on the door. My mother jumps at the first bang, and my father's eyes widened, but more in confusion than fear. He decided to go downstairs and peep through the view hole. It was our neighbor. My dad hesitantly opened the door, and I could hear my father's voice slightly tremble. "Hey, what do you need?" The next thing I hear is an entire full-blown scream argument from our neighbor, claiming that this household was his and we stole it from him. My father's uneasiness was quickly replaced with annoyance, and he simply shut the door without giving our neighbor the time of day. My dad stepped on the first step going up the stairwell when our neighbor first hit the door. Now, I'm not talking banging it with a fist. This man was full-on body slamming it. My father was stunned for a second, and my neighbor charged the door yet again. This time we began to hear the splintering of wood. Everyone reacted at once. My father went to brace the door with his body, my mother went to get the other 2 kids, and I called 911. The body slamming ensued for another 5 minutes, and while I was on the phone with 911, it stopped. I thought it was over, and I was relieved, but still, I stayed on the phone. I go peek out the front window of my house, and boy, it was only getting started. Our neighbor took his Jeep Wrangler and simply directed it straight at our house. We had zero clue what he was doing until he hit the gas and we heard the squealing of tires. Then he immediately hit the brakes. He was trying to scare us out of the house. I was still on the phone with 911 and I stepped away from the window to comfort my siblings, crack jokes and such. Eventually, the police finally arrived and they arrested him. The very next morning I left for school, still shaken from the night before. I stepped onto our front steps and saw tire marks leading up to our front door. This lunatic actually nearly rammed our door down with his car. I really never want to see this crazy man ever again, but unfortunately he lives directly to my right. Screw my life. I'm a 24-year-old female college student living 2 blocks from school. I've lived in the same spot for 2 years and have never had any issues. I have a small emotional support dog that lives with me too. This will be important later. Things just got weird this last month. A guy moved into the apartment below me. His apartment is to the right of the only stairwell leading up to my house. I always have to walk by his door to walk to class, check my mail, or get into my car. If I had to describe him, he honestly reminds me a lot of Norman Bates. Quiet, strange, small build, pale skin, and bright blue eyes. Something about him just seems off. I first met him when I was trying to leave my apartment. I was about to back up when some jerk pulled out his car, blocking me from exiting. I was getting out of my car to ask him to pull forward when my new neighbor was also getting into his car. Instead of letting me speak to the guy, he told him to move, and I politely said thank you and then left. The next day, he was waiting outside by his bike to go to class. He instead follows me up the hill to make small talk. He asked me a lot of questions which made me feel a little interrogated. Some of the questions were like,
Where are you from? How old are you? Are you single? How long have you been here?
2 days later on a Saturday morning, he knocks on my door forcefully at 8 a.m. I jump up out of my sleep and look through the peephole to see him standing there rocking back and forth. Mind you, I've only seen him twice, and we've never had a real conversation other than him trying to pry into my life like he knows me. He knocks on my door 3 more times and finally slips something underneath it and leaves. I wait about 10 minutes and open the door to find a note. It said,
Hey there, neighbor. I just have a few questions about your dog. How do you get away with having her? I want to get one, but I don't know how. I'd love to hear more. Cheers and kindest regards, Jimmy. P.S. Here's my number. Please text me.
I decided not to text him because I don't like telling every person about why I have my dog. It's really no one's business but mine and my realtor's. I was also uncomfortable with the fact that he came to my door with no knowledge that I lived in that specific unit. That's when weird things started to happen. He waits until I leave for school and rides his bike right behind me. About 2 weeks ago, I had to make several trips to my car because I bought groceries, and he stood by his window and watched me the entire time. Every time I go outside now, he watches me with the blinds open. He knows that I've noticed him too, but he doesn't seem to care. He just stares at me with a blank, lustful, creepy look in his eyes. Yesterday I took my dog outside and he came outside of his house and just stood at the back of the building just to watch us play in the grass. He just stared at me. When I wanted to come back inside, he just watched me walk upstairs and pass him, while he just had a cold look on his face. I've never been a woman who scares easily. I'm fully capable of taking care of myself. But he's making me feel very uneasy. Hey everyone, I hope you enjoyed today's video. And if you have your own personal scary story, be sure to submit that to my subreddit at reddit.com/r/southerncannibal or to my email at southerncannibal@gmail.com. I'm always looking for new stories. And before we bring this video to a close, I just want to shout out all of my $5 or more patrons, as well as my $3 or more patrons featured on screen. Shout out to Babe Lincoln, Beth A, Kate E, Katrina T, Celeste S, Ellie S, Emily W, Heather B, Howard R, Jazzy G, Jonathan C, Joseph F, Lori J, Matthew B, Michael G, Steph L, Tammy S, Terry H, 2Eki for you, and Victor R. Thank all of you so much for supporting me on Patreon. I really appreciate it more than you know. And if any of you would like to join these awesome people and also become a patron, head over to my Patreon at patreon.com/southerncannibal. Thank you everyone, and have a good one. And remember to always